Today, I want to talk about two thinkers that have both of them had a really profound and impactful influence on me personally, in so much as more so than any other thinkers or philosophers or historical figures. They have really profoundly, encountering them and their work has really profoundly influenced my own philosophy, my own metaphysics, my own worldview, the way that I think about life and live life. These two thinkers have been enormously influential to me in that regard. But more than that, they are interesting, um, firstly, just as individuals with respect to their own lives and their own thought. But for purposes of this podcast in particular, what I find interesting and what I'm going to try to unpack for you is the ways in which these two thinkers um, both overlap and intersect, uh, and at the same time depart from one another. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But I'll begin first by introducing these two thinkers. The first is Friedrich Nietzsche, and the second is Julius Evola. I'll begin by providing just a very brief biographical overview of both Nietzsche and Evola. I don't want to spend too much time talking about their lives or getting into any sort of biographical context because I think the ideas themselves are a little bit more interesting. But it's probably worth our time to, at least in the way of an introduction, to give a brief biographical overview. And so we'll start with Friedrich Nietzsche, which is probably a name that most people have at least heard. Nietzsche was born in 1844 and he died in 1900. He was a German philosopher. He's best known as a German philosopher, although it might be more accurate to call him a cultural critic, in so much as most of his work involves undertaking a critique of different aspects of, in particular, European or Western culture. But his professional training, and at least during the early years of during his early adulthood, his professional training and academic training was in the area of philology. He was a philologist. And if you're not familiar with philology, it essentially refers to study that occurs kind of at the intersection of textual analysis, literary theory, and history. So, philology is very interested in language, the origins of language, etymology, for example, how the relationship between texts and history and language. It's a robust and interesting field at which Nietzsche acquitted himself quite expertly. In fact, he was given a professorship at a university in Germany at a very young age. He was like 23 or 24 or something like that, and was given a full professorship. I think he was given the chair of philology at a major German university, which was unprecedented even at that time for someone so young to be given a full professorship. So he was a profoundly powerful thinker and recognized as such even during his own life. He is one of the few philosophers uh, that managed to achieve quite a bit of recognition during his own life, although um, he's he's become even more famous and indeed more important post mortem. To speak just a little bit about Nietzsche's areas of interest, his body of work is really quite broad. He was interested and provided commentary across a really wide scope of areas. He wrote quite a bit about aesthetics, which is, of course, the study of beauty. With respect to aesthetics, he was especially interested in literature, more particularly classic drama and tragedy, more specifically. But he also wrote quite a bit about music. His first book is called The Birth of Tragedy, and among other things, is a sort of commentary on tragedy, classical tragedy, Greek tragedy, but also music, specifically the music of the German classical composer Richard Wagner, who did The Ring of the Nibelung and Parsifal and Tristan and Isolde, among other sort of famous operas and classical compositions. Um, Nietzsche also wrote quite a bit about ontology, which in philosophy is the study of being. Might it might seem sort of like navel gazing, right? But in fact, it's ontology is a robust and very fascinating field. What does it mean to be? When we say I am, what does that mean? Um, it's actually rather difficult to unpack what we mean by that, just based on first principles. And so, sophisticated commentary and philosophy with respect to ontology can be very interesting, and that's something that Nietzsche was very fascinated in, the idea of ontology and what it meant to be. Uh, he was extremely interested in theories of truth. What does it mean to say something is true, right? What do we mean by truth? So, ethics, values, these sorts of ideas. He provided quite a bit of commentary on that. But almost certainly, Nietzsche is most famous for his commentary on religion, and more particularly, his very, it's probably fair to say, aggressive and even vehement critique of Christianity. He's almost certainly best known for his very aggressive critique of Christianity, uh, which we'll unpack whenever we begin to discuss his ideas proper. That's a reasonably good overview of Nietzsche, I think. That, of course, brings us to our second thinker, about whom I'll make just a couple of introductory biographical remarks as well. That's Julius Evola, born in 1898, so just 2 years before Nietzsche's death in 1900. Evola was born in 1898 and died in 1974. He was an Italian and is probably best known as an Italian philosopher, I guess. Certainly, it would be fair to call him a philosopher, but even more so than Nietzsche, which is no small feat. He really acquitted himself expertly in an incredible variety of domains, even more so than Nietzsche, which again is no small feat. Especially in his youth, he was actually pretty well renowned as a modernist poet and painter. He was very heavily involved in early modernist uh, schools of literature and painting, known two in particular, one known as Dada, DADA, and another known as Futurism, which was kind of pioneered by the Italian painter and thinker Marinetti, I think is his name. But probably Evola is best characterized as an esotericist. He's very interested in esotericism. What is esoteric? And esoteric, if you're unfamiliar with the term, just sort of means the hidden or the obscured. And with respect to esotericism, Avery was very interested in the esoteric elements of religions, both major and minor, both contemporary and historical, and spirituality. And indeed, um, if there's one subject or area or domain that really pervades or informs all of Avola's work, it's, in a word, spirituality. Evola is a profoundly spiritual thinker, maybe the most spiritual thinker that I can think of off the top of my head, and I don't mean that in an unprofound or sententious manner. It's whether he's writing uh, about history, Roman history in particular. He wrote tons and tons of essays. Many of his books are collections of various essays on everything from the family, concepts of masculinity, the heroism, the metaphysics of war, the history of various nation states and historical figures, uh, biographies, and commentary on the thinking of various philosophers and sort of religious and spiritual figures. Um, uh, he wrote a book on Buddhism that is actually very, very good. He wrote essays on mountain climbing and skiing. He wrote a book on tantric sex. Uh, wrote books on the metaphysics or the philosophy of power. Um, you name it, and he's almost certainly touched upon it. He really acquitted himself quite expertly across a remarkable variety of domains. But an interest and even an obsession with spirituality, and in particular, the esoteric, sort of hidden or underlying dimensions of spirituality, always underpins his commentary. And it's certainly fair to say that throughout Evola's body of work, his philosophy always posits, and there's a certain, as with Nietzsche and most thinkers for that matter, there's kind of a trajectory or development throughout his life and his body of work. But to speak quite generally, Evola's philosophy posits a worldview that is based on spiritual values that are essentially aristocratic, that are masculine, that are traditionalist with a capital T. I'll explain what I mean by that when we talk about Evola's ideas in more detail, that are heroic, and that are probably especially really defiantly reactionary, especially against what Evola considered to be modernity or the modern world. And indeed, speaking of intersections between these two thinkers, that's really the point at which Friedrich Nietzsche and Julius Evola intersect with one another. They are both aggressively critical of what we would call the modern world. Um, in fact, Evola, during his early life, was profoundly influenced by Nietzsche, but found later, as he developed philosophically and especially spiritually, that, at least in his view, there were certain limits and internal contradictions with respect to Nietzsche's thinking. And he, although he remained very clearly, and by his own admission, profoundly influenced by Nietzschean thought, later in his life, he labored to kind of push Nietzsche beyond Nietzsche, to take what parts of Nietzsche he thought worked and fit into his more traditional worldview, and to sort of leave behind what didn't work. Certainly, speaking to beyond points of intersection and to points of departure, and I'll explain this in more detail when we begin to sort of unpack the thinking of both of these gentlemen. If where they intersect is that they're both critics of the modern world, where they divert from one another is that Evola is um, a traditionalist and Nietzsche is a modern, even though he is Nietzsche is a critic of the modern world, he still is a modernist, or at least he anticipates modernism and is kind of a pre-modern. Whereas Nietzsche, even though he more so lived in the modern in the period we call modernity than Nietzsche did, rejects it even more aggressively, I think it's fair to say, than Nietzsche does, and considers himself first and foremost a traditionalist. But let's start first with those areas of intersection, right? Evola and Nietzsche, as I mentioned, are both profoundly interesting and vehement critics of what we would call the modern world. And the two, in that respect, share in common a disdain for values that are characteristic of the modern world, That includes, and this is what makes both of these thinkers slightly, more than slightly, really quite provocative. They both express very plainly a disdain for modern edifices and virtues like democracy. Both are aggressively critical of democracy. Both are extraordinarily critical of equality, especially as a value. Both are critical of rationalism. That, which is not to say the idea, they're not critical of the idea that one should be rational, but rationalism as a worldview. In other words, the idea that through empiricism and through science and through quantifying everything and reducing kind of everything to the realm of quantity and numbers and measurement. There's a movement in philosophy known as positivism, which I believe emerges most acutely out of France, and is sort of this idea that it's through science and the scientific method and that form of rationalism that's how we come to know truth. That they are both profoundly critical of that worldview. They're critical of utilitarianism, right? The idea, essentially, and this kind of ties into uh, their disdain for ideas like democracy and equality, right? Their idea that utilitarianism is essentially the idea that if you need to determine what's good, you need to, as best you can, determine what does the greatest good for the largest number of people. Nietzsche and Evola share a disdain for that type of thinking. They are not at all concerned with the masses, with what Nietzsche called the herd, with what Evola would have called the fourth estate, meaning like just the masses of people. They are not at all interested in maximizing utility for the greatest number of people possible. These are both extremely elitist thinkers. But it's interesting, I think, to point out, and important indeed to point out, that they aren't elitist in the way that most people use that term. When we think about people being elitist, we think of, I think, a kind of superficial snobbishness, especially with respect to the modern world, which is very apropos of our discussion of these two thinkers. Based upon money, right? Um, when people talk about even a political elite, what they're referring to, whether they realize it consciously or whether it's an unconscious realization, what they're referring to is an economic elite, because that's what we have. We don't in the modern world, and this is part of this is a critique that both Evola and Nietzsche would share, incidentally, is that the modern world, the elite that most characterizes that elite that rules over the modern world is not even a political elite. Certainly, it's not a military or a warrior elite, or for Avola's thinking in particular, not a spiritual elite. It's a mercantile elite. It's a profit and loss elite. It's an elite that is interested in money and not much else other than money. This is something that I talked a little bit about in the pilot episode of this podcast, in our introduction to Stoicism, and something that I even touched on in my analysis of Ezra Pound's poem Pucelle and Warbely. And certainly, though, that idea that the modern world was increasingly characterized by an obsession with with quantity rather than quality, which again ties into democracy and equality, right? Um, the idea that truth is determined by a majority vote, a majority Democratic vote, would seem hideous to both Evola and Nietzsche, in as much as I'm prepared to speak for corpses, right? So that's certainly something they share in common. A profound disdain for the modern world, and most, if not all, of the values by which the modern world is characterized. Uh, so that's certainly an area of intersection. Um, let's begin to unpack some of that, though, first by getting into Nietzsche's ideas, right? I mentioned that Nietzsche is probably most famous, definitely, Nietzsche is definitely most famous for his critique of religion, and in particular, his critique of Christianity. This is interesting, not only because his critique is interesting and in some ways prophetic, as you'll see, but it's interesting because Nietzsche's early life was very much characterized by was profoundly influenced by Christianity. His father died when he was very young. He was only 3 or 4 or something like that. His father died of, I believe, of brain cancer, and had kind of, as I understand it, a rough time on the way out, and this really profoundly affected Nietzsche, who, despite, as you'll see, positing and putting forward kind of an ethics and a philosophy of strength and power and stoicism, was in reality a very sensitive and kind of emotional, brilliant, but a very sensitive and emotional individual. And his father, who again died when he was very young, was a Lutheran pastor in their small German town of Rücken, I believe was the name of the small German town. And after Nietzsche's father passed, he was kind of he was the only boy in the family, and was kind of given over to the Christian women of the household, and was raised and reared into an almost delicate, sensitive kind of character. And early in his life, he was really profoundly moved by the Christianity of his family, and of his historical moment. It's said that as a child he would read from the Bible so feelingly to others that he would bring tears to their eyes. And some of his classmates from his very early school years described him as a little Jesus in the temple. And he talks in some of his work at least tends toward the autobiographical. In particular, he wrote a book called Ecce Homo, which means "Behold the Man," which is, if you're not familiar with that reference, Pontius Pilate is said to have said that about Jesus Christ after kind of presenting him to the angry, seething masses waiting for Jesus to be crucified. He says, "Ecce Homo, behold the man." And Nietzsche, one of his last books, it might be his last published book, or the last book that was published during his life. At least one book called The World of Power was published posthumously. It's called Ecce Homo. It's some really hilarious parts of it, actually. There's one chapter is called Why I Write Such Great Books. You could tell Nietzsche was, sensitive though he may have been in many respects. He was, well, let's say that he was perfectly well aware of his genius. And to be fair, he was a genius. Um, he attended briefly, before getting into philology and becoming, at least briefly, a stuffy academic. He attended briefly school to follow in his father's footsteps and to be a Lutheran pastor. Although he experienced what many people experience when they go through seminary school or other types of training to become priests or pastors, is he sort of lost his faith, which is, as I understand it, not an uncommon experience for people that go through a seminary school. And I don't know if for Lutherans or Protestants whether it's called seminary school, but when people go, it's not uncommon for people to undertake that degree of rigorous religious training, and in the process sort of lose their faith. And that's certainly what happened to Nietzsche. And I mentioned his fervor during his early life for Christianity, his appreciation for Christianity, and the degree to which it was doubtlessly, even by his own admission, profoundly formative to him, because that makes his later really defiant reaction and vehement and a really aggressive reaction and critique of Christianity, all the more interesting. So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's unpack Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, because it's interesting in a whole variety of ways. Um, to put it very broadly and to make it as accessible as possible, Nietzsche essentially believed that Christianity was what he called a slave morality. And he contrasted the Christian system of ethics, with the ethics in particular of the ancient world, specifically of the Greeks and of the Romans, which he considered to be examples of a master morality. What does Nietzsche mean when he says Christianity is characterized by a slave morality, as a slave morality? He means that, in his view, Christianity promotes a system of ethics, a system of values that applauds or raises up or puts on a pedestal, makes virtues of pity, of pacifism, even of weakness, of gentleness, of kindness, um, pity for others, poverty, uh, and that's to a degree probably true, although it's worth pointing out, and I don't think this is too much of a digression, it's worth pointing out that in some respects, that's more a critique of modern Christianity than it is of the proper origins of Christianity. And I could give at least two examples of that that I think will demonstrate that point reasonably well. Uh, whether you're a Christian, you've probably heard the phrase, the meek will inherit the earth, which I believe comes from the New Testament. Jesus says that the meek will inherit the earth. Uh, Meek is actually, and this is the case with a lot of the Bible, meek, what we mean by meek today, when we say a person is meek, maybe like a little mouse, is actually not at all a good translation of that passage. Um, what what the, a lot of, in other words, a great deal is lost in translation, and meek is not the best translation for what Jesus actually says, and I believe the original Greek of that gospel. Um, the word Jesus uses, and I don't recall the actual term. You'll have to forgive me, but the word Jesus uses doesn't mean meek in the sense that we mean meek today. What it actually means is those who keep their swords sheathed. So what Jesus actually says is those who keep their swords sheathed will inherit the earth, which of course implies that those who will inherit the earth have swords, know how to use them, and even are prepared to use them, but also know when to keep them sheathed, which almost in the sense that a Stoic might appreciate, kind of references temperance and wisdom and justice, and even courage, right? Knowing when to use your sword and knowing when to keep it sheathed. But you still have a sword. In fact, in the gospel according to Matthew, I believe it is, Jesus says, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and go out and buy one. And says that I did not come to bring peace, but the sword. Um, Maybe a modern analog of that would be is, if you don't have an AR-15, go out and sell your Xbox and your big screen TV and buy an AR-15. That whether people would like to admit it, that's actually a very good modern analog, I think, for if you don't have a sword, go out, sell the clothes off your back and buy a sword, because I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. These are ideas that are very characteristic of the origins of Christianity, and more particularly Catholicism, which remember comes out of Rome, and it is profoundly influenced by, at least to a degree, by Roman ethics, right? Roman ethics, right? We're talking about the Christianity and more particularly the Catholicism of the Crusades, of the Knights Templar, which was essentially a group of uh, spiritual warriors, of priests who killed, right? Of the Teutonic Knights, and their culture and ethics of chivalry, that in some respects puts the Roman in Roman Catholicism. Um, Many modern Christians, especially Protestants, uh, object to those elements of Christianity, of Catholicism in particular, that are kind of pagan in their dispensation and in their tone and interpretation. But the origins of Christianity, again, in particular Roman Catholicism, are profoundly pagan, and find expression and influence from uh, certain elements of pagan ethics and morality, um, strength and almost a masculine, virile, aggressive, life-affirming sort of philosophy. In any event, to to the degree that Nietzsche was aware of those origins of Christianity, I shouldn't doubt that he was. He was extremely well learned in a number of fields, Christianity most particularly, perhaps. Yet he, irrespective of what the origins of Christianity and Catholicism may have looked like, that's certainly not the Christianity that Nietzsche observed during his lifetime, and it's certainly not the Christianity we observe in our lifetime, with very few exceptions. Mainstream Christianity, including Catholicism, which is, with the exception of maybe Eastern Orthodox Christianity, is definitely kind of the or root or origin of Christianity. These are, I think Nietzsche's right. These are increasingly um, this is increasingly a religion characterized by a system of ethics that exalts pacifism and pity, and promotes values that are decidedly modern, that are democratic, that value equality, that are anti-hierarchical, and that are increasingly even utilitarian and rationalistic. I frequently see, in as much as I see Christian or Catholic people, posting on social media or engaging in debate, I increasingly see Christians almost attempting to battle atheists or agnostics or non-believers on away from home, and that is to say, on the home field of the agnostics or the secularists or the non-believers, by trying to offer up, like, well, actually, there's actually science to support, A, B, C, D, which, as a brief aside, I would strongly recommend against. Right? Don't fight at home when you could fight at home, not away. Um, in any event, Nietzsche saw in Christianity a morality that to his view, was fundamentally opposed to the master morality of the ancient world. Again, specifically that of the Greeks and of the Romans. He was especially influenced by Greek philosophy and Stoic philosophy, which, of course, we talked about in the pilot episode to this podcast. So if the slave morality of Christianity, to Nietzsche's view, is characterized by weakness and pacifism and pity and kindness and all those sorts of ideas, the master morality, Nietzsche said, the master morality of the ancients, for example, of the Stoics, was characterized by strength, by honor, by courage. It was a heroic type of um, ethics or philosophy, right? Um, it the idea of this sort of pitiful sacrificed, um, God on the cross versus, the warrior gods like Thor, with Mjolnir, his hammer, that sort of thing. Although it's fascinating to point out also as a brief aside that that Odin, who in certain forms of European paganism is the god of both war and wisdom, sacrifices himself by hanging himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for like 8 or 9 days or something like that. So there's sacrifice even in these pagan religions, and a lot of this is you know aimlessly tied together and intersecting in complicated ways that are hard for us to begin even to appreciate or unpack. But that still gets that provides at least a good overview of Nietzsche's view of the difference between slave morality and master morality. We have to remember that Nietzsche is a hierarchical, elitist sort of thinker, right? He does not believe in democracy. He does not believe in equality. He doesn't believe that all people are equal. For Nietzsche, everything is hierarchical, and he shares this in common. He shares this in common with Evola, incidentally. Everything is hierarchical, right? The idea that all people are equal would to Nietzsche be an absurd proposition, right? Nietzsche, for Nietzsche, there's there's a hierarchy between groups of individuals. You can't say that two groups, whatever those groups are equal, because essentially, and there's some philosophical support to this, incidentally. There's what's called the principle of, I believe it's called the principle of discernibles. Leibniz, a German philosopher, was one of the main proponents of this, but other people unpack it as well. And it's essentially the idea that to say something equals something is to say A equals B is to say that A is the same as B, and this is true mathematically, right? When you're young and you're in the first or second grade, something like that, 8, 9 years old, and you're just learning really basic arithmetic, say addition and subtraction, your teacher might say to you, okay, well, Billy has one apple, Sally gives him one apple. How many apples does Billy have? And you say, okay, well, 1 + 1 = 2. Billy has 2 apples. Um, and that's all well and good in so much as, when you're 8 or 9 and your teacher wants to lay out the foundation or the framework of really basic arithmetic, it has to be it's useful to use those sorts of analogies and put it in those sort of simple terms. But then when you get a little bit older, and for example, you take an algebra class, just to say nothing of more complicated mathematics like calculus, etc. But let's just say you take an algebra class, right, in high school. You learn that what you're actually doing, and most people will be familiar with this terminology, is you're balancing the equation, right? In other words, 1 + 1 = 2. What that literally means, mathematically and linguistically, is 1 + 1 is the same as 2, but differently represented. So if Billy has one apple and Sally gives him one apple, he has 2 apples. 1 + 1 is 2. 1 + 1 = 2. So when you say, for example, so Nietzsche might say, for example, to a Nietzschean point of view, when you say men and women are equal, what you're literally saying is men and women are the same. And Nietzsche rejects that, as does Hegel, right? Um, that is an idea that is, and we touched upon this very briefly in our introduction to Stoicism, the idea that in the modern world, unlike the world of antiquity, the ancient world, the world of the Greeks and the Romans, and even well before that, in the modern world, equality has been elevated to a virtue, and maybe the highest virtue. Certainly, it's among the highest virtues. But Nietzsche, along with Evola for that matter, would argue that equality is a false god, that to raise it to the level of a virtue is absurd, because linguistically, mathematically, even naturalistically, it it doesn't make any sense. It is an idea that is totally contra naturam, totally not in accordance with nature or reality. There's a hierarchy, Nietzsche would say, between groups of individuals. There's a hierarchy within groups of individuals, right? So Nietzsche would say, no, of course, men and women aren't equal, which is to say, of course, men and women aren't the same. Um, Nietzsche, incidentally, has a reputation for being something of a misogynist. I don't think that's actually a very fair uh, reading, or a very close or fair reading of his work. Although there are a few really kind of funny aphoristic observations he made about women. Um, One is that woman is God's second mistake. Use that one on a feminist type and see how clever and quick they are. Because if they're not very clever and quick, they'll get really offended. But if they are a little on the clever side, they'll realize that, of course, that implies that man was God's first mistake. So it's a good way to test the cleverness of a feminist type if you're interested in poking that bear. Another, and this I have to say, take it or leave it, is probably the truest observation of women I have ever encountered. It comes directly from Nietzsche. I've for a long time said that this is the most accurate observation of women I've ever personally encountered. And that's that women make the highs higher and the lows more frequent. You could take that or you could leave it, but I've certainly found it to be true, whatever that's worth. In any event, Nietzsche would say that there's a hierarchy not only between men and women, between those two groups of individuals, but within those groups, right? Are women equal to men, which is to say, are men and women the same? Of course not, Nietzsche would say. Nietzsche, and you have to understand about Nietzsche that he is often, frequently, purposefully provocative, right? He's a provocative guy. He likes to poke, he likes to prod, he likes to provoke, he likes to offend. It could be a very effective rhetorical strategy. Frankly, you get people's attention when you kind of step on their toes a little bit. But he said something to the effect of, uh, I'm paraphrasing, but man is made for war, and woman for the recreation and creation of more warriors. Everything else is folly. I don't think he means that literally. But he is underlining what, in his view, is a fundamental difference between the purposes in life that men and women inhabit and should strive toward. And so, in that respect, there is a hierarchy. There is a difference between men and women. But Nietzsche would go on to say that there's, of course, a hierarchy within those groups. Right? Is every man equal to every other man? Well, of course not. Is every woman equal to every other woman? Well, of course not. And in fact, to push it even further, to really take a Nietzschean point of view, Nietzsche would say that there's also a hierarchy even within the individual, right? You are the best possible version of yourself, whatever that looks like every day. So there's a hierarchy between groups, there's a hierarchy within groups, there's a hierarchy within the individual. When you adopt this sort of view and push that sort of value system to its furthest margins, it's very difficult to rationalize democracy or equality or kind of utilitarian ideologies. And this is very interesting about Nietzsche because, unlike Evola and other thinkers and writers and philosophers and historical figures who have similar views, Nietzsche is still relatively popular in academia, which has always befuddled me, to be frank. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that no one actually reads Nietzsche. They, at best, read someone who has read Nietzsche, or they watch some YouTube videos on Nietzsche and kind of get this middling NPR, BBC, Channel 4, YouTube kind of introduction to Nietzsche. And there was a movement, particularly after World War II, of writers like of historians and kind of Nietzsche historians of Nietzsche and editors of Nietzsche. One of them was named Kaufman. There was another guy named Deleuze. So these sort of leftist liberal secular types that really wanted, especially after World War II, to kind of salvage Nietzsche's reputation, which had taken a big hit during World War II for various reasons that really aren't within the remit of this particular discussion. But to be honest, I think that with a few exceptions, those translations and those interpretations and those readings of Nietzsche are not really done in good faith. Um, and I remember actually, I was a professor of English very briefly, and I remember running into another English professor in the hall. I walked out of my office, I ran into her, and she and I were on relatively friendly terms. And I don't recall exactly how we got on the topic of Nietzsche, but I remember very well her saying to me, "You know, it blows my mind how many people in this department and in academia or generally um, really claim to be big fans of Nietzsche and promote Nietzsche. It's like they haven't actually read him. And of course, I liked her and I wanted to be polite. And I am in person, if not in my podcast, in person, I'm a relatively, believe it or not, gregarious fellow. And I'm thinking in my mind that she's absolutely right. Although those are all the parts that I like about Nietzsche, is that is his elitism and his disdain for democracy and equality and utilitarian and all those things. Those are the things that sort of masculine pagan vitalist life affirming energy is what attracts me to Nietzsche. But she was absolutely right. And I've found that myself. I've even met people that are really willing to speak at some length about Nietzsche, but seem to have not read a single word of him. And I can only imagine they've kind of skimmed some YouTube videos or something like that. So it's really fascinating that Nietzsche should still be relatively popular um, in academia, in not just philosophy departments, but in study of literature, English departments, etc. Despite the fact that, to all practical intents and purposes, the sum and substance of his philosophy and his views are totally antithetical to the sum and substance of those views that most characterize the modern academy. And that's just an observation of fact. Um, in any event, speaking of the intersection of Evola and Nietzsche, these are areas in which Evola and Nietzsche intersect. Evola echoes. Evola too, is critical of certain elements of Christianity, although he's not nearly as aggressively critical as Nietzsche is. Evola agrees that particularly the modern iterations and modern expressions of Christianity and Catholicism in particular have sort of become pale antecedents or simulacrums or kind of pathetic, middling, weakened, um, whittled down versions of what were origins that were much closer to what Evelyn would consider the world of tradition and the master morality of the ancient world. Master morality, again, being sort of a system of ethics that promotes strength and honor and courage, and essentially takes a heroic view, a masculine heroic view of life. It sort of pushes life beyond its own limits and seeks a life beyond life. These are sentiments with which Evola would have absolutely agreed with respect to the kind of the foundation that Nietzsche lays out. And that's no doubt the reason that, at least during his early life, Evola was profoundly influenced by Nietzsche. But as we'll see, Nietzsche, Evola later sort of breaks from Nietzsche without entirely repudiating or refuting Nietzsche, and instead sort of takes what works from Nietzsche, leaves behind what doesn't, and with respect to having taken what in Evola's view works about Nietzsche, seeks to push that beyond its own limits and to give it a kind of energy, to imbue it with a certain energy and valiance. And volitional kind of sense of heroic action that is maybe lacking in Nietzsche's philosophy into itself. That being said, I want to talk a little bit about. I want to get to slightly more detail about Nietzsche's criticism of modernity, which is really the crux of what I think is going to be most fascinating about our comparison of Evola and Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's criticism of modernity, again, I mentioned that Evola and Nietzsche, if nothing else, are both um, profound, potent, and vigorous critics of what we would call modernity. And by modernity, we mean, I'm putting this is a much too simplistic way to put it, but I want this to be as accessible as possible. By modernity, we really mean the world after the European Enlightenment, after the emergence of philosophies like Darwinism and utilitarianism, democracy after the Industrial Revolution. Um, Different thinkers date the emergence of modernity, sort of demarcate or separate what we might call the traditional or the ancient world from the modern world at different times. Evola kind of dates that slide or that transition to somewhere in the Middle Ages. You'll get different timestamps, to use that term, from different thinkers. But by modern, we don't just mean like right now. We don't just mean contemporary. We mean we're differentiating the ancient world from the modern world. So what is the meat and potatoes of Nietzsche's criticism of the modern world? Well, it's probably best captured. The spirit of it is probably best captured in his proclamation of what is called the death of God. The and that's not exactly what it sounds like, um, but it is essentially at the Nietzsche's concept of the death of God is essentially at the heart of his critique of modernity. And I'll read just a very brief passage from one of Nietzsche's books. It's sometimes translated the happy science, other times it's translated the gay science. This is a quote, a brief excerpt from that book regarding the death of God. Nietzsche says, quote, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" I want to point out firstly that this is a reasonably good representative of Nietzsche's writing, which is not at all like not at all stuffy, like a lot of philosophy. Nietzsche's not necessarily an easy read, but he can be a very fun read. He's very poetic, for lack of a better word. There's a kind of exuberance, and he could be very, very funny and witty. A lot of his writing is just like in brief, like aphorisms. He could be a really fun read, and he is one of the great, strictly just from a technical perspective in terms of the quality of his prose and of his writing. He is one of the masters of modern prose. The German in particular is absolutely astonishing, and because he's such a major figure, there's some really good translations, and this particular passage is a really good example of that. Some really great lines here, right? How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? Who will wipe this blood off us? What festivals of atonement? What games shall we have to invent? Really, all these sort of rhetorical questions, all kinds of interesting kind of semiotic gestures here. He's a real pleasure to read. But an analysis of his actual writing aside, it's important to point out here that Nietzsche is not referring to the literal death of God. He's using the death of God. When he says God is dead, he's using this, quote, death of God as an analogy a provocative one. He's being provocative, which again is extremely characteristic of Nietzsche. He's using this analogy to identify a fundamental shift in worldview that has been ushered in by modernity. He is trying to identify the driving force behind the shift from the ancient world, from the world of tradition, to the modern world. Let's unpack that a bit, right? In Europe, there's the emergence of what's called the Enlightenment. Um, that is accompanied, of course, by the rapid development and the spread of science and a worldview that is based on rationalism and materialism and empiricism, that sort of begins to suggest that, look, if you want if you want to know whether something is true, you have to undertake a kind of quantitative measurement of it. That's what we mean by like empiricism, right? If it can't be measured, then how could you even know it's there? How could you know it's true? This is a rationalistic, materialistic, quote unquote, enlightened empirical worldview. And what this does is it sort of wipes away, more than sort of, it totally wipes away foundational certainties upon which previous human life in the traditional world, in the ancient world, for example, had been totally based, right? Namely, the idea of a transcendent realm, a, a, a realm or the existence of a god or gods around which all of life totally orbited. It's very, very, very difficult, even for it's very, very difficult for modern people to understand, even those modern people that, or to some degree or another, religious. It's very difficult, maybe almost impossible, to understand the degree to which a belief in God or gods was the absolute center of life for most humans for most of human history. All meaning, all purpose, even life in otherwise practical terms, right? Politics, the state, morals, all of this was completely anchored by a belief in a god or gods, in a transcendent realm, and in metaphysics, right? Which just means beyond physics, right? In a world beyond the material world, beyond the physical world. Jesus Christ says, "My kingdom is not of this earth," right? Um, even before Christianity, but certainly during the height of Christianity's influence as well, a belief in that transcendent spiritual realm was the center of life, and every attendant dimension of life orbited that center. And what, and so in other words, the modern world is that world, that point at which, through processes of so-called enlightenment, through the development and increasingly ubiquitous or pervasive adoption of science and rationalism and materialism, um, it's a transition from a realm of quality to a realm of quantity, from spirituality to materialism, from intuition to rationalism, from belief to in faith to empiricism, right? And this changes everything. Uh, Even as recently as World War II, right? The Japanese emperor was believed by the Japanese people to be a living incarnation of the sun god, right? Um, that was true for most of human history with respect to elite figures, right? In Europe, there is what was known as the divine right of kings. This idea that kings derived their power not from the people, or for that matter, any sort of material, worldly, or earthly force, but from above, from beyond, from God or gods. Even in Rome, the Roman emperor, and even before Rome has different periods where there are emperor periods. I don't want to too much complicate this stuff by getting into Roman history, but even during the height of the Roman Imperium, of the Roman Empire, there was a belief that the leader of Rome was a pontifex, which is a Latin word that literally means bridge. That leader was seen as being fundamentally and essentially possessed of a kind of otherworldly, super rational power that enabled them to act as a bridge, a literal bridge between the material world and that which is beyond, the Olympian world, if we're talking about the Romans, right? The world of transcendence, between the world, our world of becoming, the material world where everything is changing, and is in a state of flux, and is therefore always in a state of becoming, and this transcendent realm of perfect unity and stability and being, right? The Romans considered their leader to be a pontifex, a bridge between those two worlds, and he had to embody uh, at both a transcendent level and an immanent, meaning a worldly or material level, a kind of supernatural power and character that made that connection between those two worlds possible. And people believe this, mind, body, and soul, right? Um, there was no, at least, serious debate about whether there was a world beyond this one. Even skeptics like Socrates, um, who, by all accounts, take a didn't quite take the view of the Greek pantheon, that the Greek god and goddesses that, say, the average Greek did, still believed in a higher power. There, for most of human history, certainly before modernity, there's no serious debate. There was absolutely no serious debate as to whether there was a higher power, and indeed, that was the locus, the point at which all life orbited. It was the awareness of this higher power, and in an attempt to be in some form or another in contact with it, right? So that's what we mean. That's what Nietzsche means when he says God is dead. He says that uh, essentially people will lose their faith, and they will become enraptured by the spirit of enlightenment, quote unquote, by a spirit of rationalism. They will become less spiritual, to say nothing of less religious and more materialistic. Everything will be based on what can be quantified, what can be empirically measured. And when that happens, and now we're really getting into the meat of the matter, when that happens, everything becomes arbitrary and everything becomes subjective. Because if there is no longer a truth with a capital T, right? And then it becomes a matter of your truth and my truth. And you may, as I have, you may have heard people say this, right? Well, that's your truth. Well, you have your truth, I have my truth. That proposition would not have made any sense whatsoever to a person living in antiquity, even a skeptical person, right? Um, that would not have made any sense whatsoever. There's just truth. One plus one equals two. 1 + 1 is the same as 2, versus this kind of 1984 2 + 2 = 5 sort of thing, right? In a world without God, in a world without objective truth with a capital T, in philosophy that's sometimes called metaphysical objectivism, maybe a good analog for that is like a religious person who is fundamentalist, who believes absolutely in like let's say a fundamentalist Christian, right, that believes like every word in the Bible is scripture, and is 100% divine and true and can't be argued with, right? Once you've lost even kind of pale versions, or once you've departed from even less aggressive versions of that level of metaphysical objectivism, that amount of certainty and truth with the capital T, then what you start to see develop is a worldview that is arbitrary, that is, in other words, subjective. It's based upon everyone has their individual view. It's my view, it's my truth, you have your truth, I have my truth, etc. And whatever you think of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, whatever you think of his critique of modernity, I think it's very hard to argue that that this hasn't been the case. It's almost a little bit ironic to call Nietzsche a prophet, in so much as he was something of an aggressive opponent of religion proper, and even spirituality more generally. But he was indeed prophetic in this regard. And just to put it into a perspective that I think will very much touch upon our modern or contemporary moment. However you feel about this debate, right? It's not at all the purpose of this podcast to unpack this particular. It's not even a political debate. It's really an ontological debate, a debate about what it means to be. But however you feel about it, our really postmodern society cannot even agree anymore about what makes a man and what makes a woman, right? However you feel about that, that is precisely the type of subjectivity that Nietzsche prophesized would occur, right? An idea that and I realize people will say, well, this ancient tribe or this group of people actually believe in the third gender, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, it's true that there are certain exceptions to the general rule, but this is just an observation of fact. For all of human history, such as we have record of it, the general prevailing predominant view has been that there are men, and men have a very specific purpose in life, and there are women, and women have a very specific purpose in life. And exceptions to those rules notwithstanding, that's just a law that's built into the nest. And in fact, where there are exceptions, they only serve to reinforce the rule, right? The debate we see around gender, the idea, and as has been said by certain academics, for example, that there are as many genders as there are people, right? This is a type of radical subjectivity of exactly the type Nietzsche prophesies. And if he were alive today, again, he could speak for a corpse, he would say, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Without some sort of transcendental force beyond life to anchor meaning and purpose and our very notion of existence itself, it's just inevitable that level, that degree, that of profoundly radical subjectivity will emerge. It's par for the course, so to speak, right? And indeed, although Nietzsche was an atheist and may have privately welcomed the collapse of Christianity, it's hard to say, certainly he was an atheist, and he may or may not have privately welcomed the collapse of Christianity privately. Certainly he predicted that this would be totally catastrophic for mankind, because the absence of Christianity and other major sources of faith and purpose and transcendental meaning. Again, truth with a capital T, not just your truth, not just my truth, but the truth, right? In the absence of of those institutions and that force, we would find a vacuum. And as with all other power vacuums, right? They that void will be filled by something. And Nietzsche predicted, quite accurately, I think I should point out, that initially he was already seeing the development of this during his own time. People would attempt to fill that void with science and with rationalism. You don't need God. We have science now to explain all of the phenomena we experience, right? We could take a rationalistic, empirical, positivistic view. We have the scientific method. We're enlightened now, right? There's no more need for God. But Nietzsche, I think, again, quite accurately believed that wouldn't be enough, because science, and this is a very, very simplified version of Nietzsche's critique of science, but Nietzsche's view of science is something like this. It's an extremely useful tool, for example, for explaining how something works, but it doesn't tell you why something is what it is, right? It's not, it it doesn't do very much for ontology, for an actual real robust study of being. So take fire, for example. Okay, great, there's a science to fire. Um, Fire is an exothermic chemical reaction whereby a fuel source is rapidly oxidized, producing heat and flame, right? Uh, okay, that explains how fire works, but it doesn't actually tell us what fire is, or even more importantly, why it is. Again, is that useful knowledge? You bet. Because it means in order for a fire to occur, you have to have heat, you have to have fuel, and you have to have oxygen. And so, therefore, if you want to fight a fire or eliminate a fire, put out a fire, you either remove the heat, you either smother the fire and get rid of the oxygen, or you remove the fuel source, right? Um, Useful to know if you're trying to put out a fire, or for that matter, start a fire, but it doesn't tell you why. It's a description of how something works. It's not an explanation of what something is. And this may seem like, okay, well, that that's interesting, maybe, but that just seems like this navel gazing, overly theoretical. How is that practical? It's absolutely practical. We can't agree on what makes a man or a woman anymore, right? And you'd think if science could tell us anything, and people will make that argument, right? Well, what's a man? A man has an XY chromosome. A woman has two X chromosomes. No, that tells us something about how at the material level a man is constituted, or how at the material level a woman is constituted. But for a good portion of our population, apparently, clearly, that's not good enough, right? So in other words, try though it might, science, and this is Nietzsche's view, right? Try though it might, science will not be able to fill that void. It will forever be a pale unsuccessful attempt to fill that void. So what would occur? Well, Nietzsche predicted that what would occur would be widespread nihilism, uh, which nihilism essentially means the belief in nothing, right? Atheism, right? Widespread pessimism, and even a will to nothingness, which is really interesting. The idea that this lack of a transcendental anchor for all life and all purpose and all meaning would lead people to adopt this kind of nihilistic worldview. Everything is arbitrary, everything is accidental, everything is by chance, there's no greater meaning, no greater purpose. It's all just a journey. You have your truth, I have my truth. Um, that's that's actually it sounds, and people often frame it as a very positive sort of freeing up of human possibility, but at least from a Nietzschean perspective, that is a profoundly pessimistic and negative worldview, because it's essentially constituted by a will toward nothingness. Because if you say your truth is just as good as my truth, is just as good as his truth, is just as good as her truth, then there's no value to truth whatsoever, right? If you say that you are whatever you feel at any given moment is the truth, right? And I don't mean too much to harp on gender ideology. That's not really the point of this talk, but unfortunately, it provides one of the best and most contemporary analogs that will help people, however they feel about gender ideology, understand the kind of Nietzschean argument. There are millions of people all over the world that believe that not only are there as many genders as there are people, but that, and not only can you change your gender once, but you can change it an infinite amount of times. You can have a different gender every day if you want to, right? In other words, there's no such thing as gender, right? If gender can mean anything at any time to anyone, then there's no such thing as gender. If man can mean anything at any time to anyone, then there's no such thing as man. If woman could mean anything at any time to anyone, then there's no such thing as woman. That is a will. Nietzsche would say that is a will to nothingness. And we see this, to get a little bit away from gender ideology, because I don't want people to get too wrapped up in that. We see this even in political slogans, right? Think about, I remember, I believe Barack Obama's, um, his big political slogan was hope and change, right? Hope and change. Well, here's the thing. This is actually, to get a little bit technical, that's called neuro-linguistic programming, which means you use a word like hope and you use a word like change. But here's the thing. Just about everybody hopes something, and just about everyone wants at least something to change. So what people will do is they'll plug in to hope and change whatever their own subjective values and views are, right? So in other words, hope and change could mean anything, and therefore it doesn't mean anything at all. But I'm not just picking on Democrats. The same is true of Donald Trump, right? Make America great again. Well, what does that mean exactly, right? Some people hear that, and look, they either like Trump or they don't like Trump, just like people either like Obama and they don't like Obama. If they do like Obama, then they plug in their hopes and they plug in their change. If they don't like Obama, then they dispense with it. If people like Trump, then if the people don't like Trump, then they're not interested in Make America Great Again, or they find some way to deconstruct or unpack it. If they do like Trump, then Make America Great Again is a kind of made to fit. It's like the Burger King of political slogans. Have it your way. Make America Great Again. Like, what does that mean? Obviously, it's an appeal to nostalgia, right? To, looking back toward quote unquote better times. But what better times? Are you nostalgic for the 90s? Are you nostalgic for the 80s? Ah, the Reagan years, right? Those were the days. What about the 70s? What about the 60s, right? Ah, Woodstock. Probably a lot of people that really enjoyed Woodstock. I can't imagine vote for Donald Trump, but people grow and change. Who knows? Point is, you could be nostalgic for the 60s. You could be nostalgic for the 50s. What does it mean to say make America great again? That's a plug and play slogan. And because it could mean just about anything, like hope and change, it doesn't mean anything. That's the kind of radical subjectivity that Nietzsche prophesized would totally overtake the worldview of most people in the Western European world in particular, but indeed beyond, right? And this, I think, in some ways terrified Nietzsche. He hoped, it's worth mentioning, that there might be an antidote to this. And that antidote is what Nietzsche called the Ubermensch, which is a German word for which there is, unfortunately, not a good translation at all. Probably the most common translation is Superman. That, which it's unfortunate that's the most common translation because it's by far the worst translation. Not for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is there are certain connotations having to do with a particular comic superhero. But it's also just even beyond that. It's just not a very good translation. A better translation might be the Overman or the Beyond Man or the More Than Man. But the idea is for Nietzsche is that the Ubermensch was a higher type of man. And Nietzsche's claim was if, and capital letters underlined and bolded, if we were lucky in the space left open by the collapse of Christianity, the Ubermensch would emerge, then we would see the emergence of an individual or a type of individual, a type of man who would embrace, in fact, who wouldn't despair, who wouldn't become pessimistic, who wouldn't be given over to nihilism, and instead would embrace the uncertainty of a world without objective or apparent meaning and find strength and purpose precisely in that struggle. This is in many respects inspired by Darwinism, this idea, apropos of evolution, that man is, and Nietzsche said basically as much, that man, meaning Homo sapiens, men such as we are, or men, people such as we are people, are just a bridge to the Übermensch. And we can almost sort of interpret that as the Übermensch, the overman, the beyond man, is sort of the next stage in human evolution. But the truth is, Nietzsche actually warned that it was much more likely that another type, and we almost shouldn't say man, but another type of creature would emerge in response to a world without meaning. And that type of individual, that hideous type of creature, Nietzsche called the last man. And the last man, in Nietzsche's view, refers to a really contemptible kind of creature, not even worthy of being called a man, who ultimately desires, above all, only to live a life of comfort without ever having to undertake any real serious thought about what it means to truly be an individual, without ever taking any real serious interest in personal development, the way a Stoic might, to refer to our previous episode on Stoicism, right? To that, the last man has zero interest in adopting philosophy as a living, breathing sort of worldview that is volitional and life affirming. It propels one beyond oneself. Instead, Nietzsche says, the last man sort of sloughs down to the level of the lowest common denominator and slumps into a bovine, meaning a kind of cattle or cow-like existence, and really lives only for pleasure and comfort and happiness. These are the highest virtues of the last man. Whereas for the Stoic, the four cardinal virtues are wisdom and courage and justice and temperance. For the last man, what is virtuous is that which brings comfort, that which provides pleasure, that which promotes happiness, right? The last man is totally untroubled, totally disinterested by what is, in fact, the deadly seriousness of the challenge set before him in the wake of the death of God. Look, you've got your truth, I got my truth. A man wants to be a woman wants to be a man. Who cares if someone wants to identify as a duck? Not my business, right? This is the last man. And again, in Nietzsche's view, this is characteristic of the last man. And in so much as we're prepared to admit that Nietzsche may have been onto something here, if we look around us, I think if we're being perfectly honest with ourselves and with others, as difficult as it may be to do so, it it's I'll speak personally. It sure seems to me that it sure seems to me that I am surrounded more by individuals characterized by the kind of values um, that describe the last man rather than any sort of Ubermensch, right? Um, here's a test. If you're so inclined, go and ask somebody about progress. All these believers in progress and science, right? Um, Ask them, what meaningful progress have we really made since antiquity, since the ancient world, since the Greeks or the Romans? I've had this conversation with countless people, and 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, maybe 100 times out of 100, to be perfectly honest with you, in as much as I could remember, anytime I've ever asked someone that question, because here's the thing, as certainly we're going to get into Evola in just a moment. As with Evola, I personally don't believe we have made any serious progress since the world of antiquity. It's true that we've developed a great deal of even admittedly very useful technology that in particular has made our lives a great deal more comfortable. But what about our values? We may bestride, especially in the Western world, much of the rest of the world as this kind of technological colossus, but we're totally empty inside. We don't believe in anything. We are totally lost at sea. And not only are our values not an improvement upon, let's say, Stoic values, right? The Stoic values are a great example of values that are characteristically um, traditional values, values of antiquity, right? Wisdom, courage, justice, temperance. Not only have we not improved upon those values, our values have gotten worse. Happiness is not, it's not that joy, there's a poet named Robinson Jeffers, and in one of his poems he says, look, joy is better than sorrow, but joy isn't great. Inner peace is great. Self-control is great. Strength is great, right? Happiness is good, sure. It's better than sorrow. It beats feeling like shit. But happiness is not as great as wisdom. Happiness, it's not worth trading courage for happiness. It's not worth trading justice for happiness. It's not worth trading temperance for happiness, right? And if you ask most people, what progress have we made compared to the ancient world? What they'll tell you, I'm telling you, I've heard this 100 times. Well, we have air conditioning, and we have Xboxes and big screen TVs, and we have the internet, and if you want to have an answer to a question, you don't even have to work for it. You just Google it and get probably some ideologically contoured, curated answer that's approved by whatever the ruling dispensation happens to be. Um, that's not only not an improvement in terms of an ethics of values, it's a slippage. It's worse. So for all of the comfort that people in their hideous bovine existence exalt as virtuous in the meaning and purpose of life, we've we've traded for that wisdom. I mean, how many genuinely wise people do you know? I don't know very many. And that doesn't come from a position of elitism. I would really, I'll be I'll be a little bit vulnerable with you here. Frankly, I'm desperate to meet some wise folks. I'd love some wise mentors in my life. I can't find any. I can't. I've had a really hard time my whole life finding wise men to mentor me. Some men are better than others, and I've been lucky to know some sharp guys. But really, I and ladies, to be fair. Um, but I got to be honest with you, I don't know a whole lot of wise people, but I know a whole lot of idiots. I don't know a whole lot of courageous people. I know a handful of people with some courage, but most people I know, even people I like, are hideous cowards, not just physically, but spiritually, right? Like they don't want to make any trouble. Oh, my name gets out there. What will other people think? Who gives a damn what other people think, man? If you're telling the truth, tell the truth. Most people don't have any courage at all. To, to put a finer point on that, what you usually see is if people have courage, they don't have very much wisdom. And if people have wisdom, they don't have very much courage. And to quote Thucydides, that's what happens when you separate your warriors from your scholars, which used to be one caste, one warrior cast together, uh, like the samurai or the Teutonic Knights. A discussion for another podcast. The point is, for all of our comfort, I don't know a whole lot of wise people. I don't know a whole lot of courageous people. I don't know. I do not, when I look around, I don't see very much justice at all. In fact, quite the opposite. I don't see people tempering themselves and controlling their passions. I see a whole civilization collapsing because people can't keep their passions on a leash. That's what I see. Why do people get divorced so much? This is a lesson that I learned from a scholar of Shakespeare. I forget her name. I wish I could remember it, but she said, if there's one thing I learned from Shakespeare, she said, if you want to get happy, I'm sorry, if you want to get married in order to be married. Don't get married to be happy. Because if you get married to be happy, here's what's going to happen. Inevitably, if you're married for long enough, you're going to find that, at least for a period of time, that other person's not making you happy. And then the whole thing will seem for naught if the whole purpose of your marriage was to be happy. On the other hand, if you get married in order to be married, that is to say, to establish as a union greater than the constituent parts of either individual, if you establish your marriage as a union greater than yourself and your spouse, and it becomes something greater than either of you, that is above you and beyond you, that you look up to and that you serve, then you can keep a marriage going. Talk to someone that's been married for 50 years, and they'll tell you, oh, I couldn't stand that man during the entire Carter administration. My God, from 1985 to 1990, there was hardly a night that I didn't think of smothering that old bastard in his sleep, right? Your people are no individual, however much you genuinely love them, is going to make you happy all the time, right? You're going to go, if you're going to be with someone for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, you're going to go through really long periods of intense discomfort and unhappiness. So it shouldn't surprise anyone that more than half of marriages, it's probably close to quarter of marriages now end in divorce, because everyone's getting married in order to be happy. Happiness is not a virtue. Wisdom is a virtue. Courage is a virtue. Justice is a virtue. Temperance is a virtue. If you practice wisdom, if you practice courage, if you practice justice, if you practice temperance, you could become yourself. You could become a better version of yourself. You could maybe stay married for 50 years. You can if all you care about is happiness and comfort. Because relationships are often not happy, and they're for damn sure often extremely uncomfortable, discomforting, right? So this isn't just this theoretical, elitist looking down on the masses. This is a real problem that Nietzsche very prophetically called over 100 years ago now. And I think it's just an observation of fact that when we look around, do most of the people by whom you're surrounded, even if you kind of like them, do they seem to be possessed or kind of on an upward trajectory, or are they just kind of going along to get along? most people live a completely bovine existence, inundated to the television and its vapid nonsense, right? That's just how it is. And that is the future that Nietzsche feared would emerge in the space left to us in a world devoid of transcendent meaning, in a world where, quote unquote, God is dead. Now, why bookend this discussion with Evola? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, Evola, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, was tremendously influenced by Nietzsche during his youth and agrees with Nietzsche that the modern worldview was increasingly characterized by a pitiful system of values and ethics, that people were increasingly bovine, that our elite was increasingly mercantile, and that values of democracy and equality were superficial at best and, more frankly, totally at odds with what is in fact true with a capital T, with what is secundum naturam, in accordance with the natural world. But more than that, Evola takes what, in his view, works with respect to Nietzsche's philosophy. More particularly, he shares and adopts Nietzsche's assessment of the problem of modernity. The issue Evola develops later on in his life with respect to Nietzsche isn't Nietzsche's assessment of the problem, it's Nietzsche's prescription for a solution. And so what Evola attempts to do, I think quite successfully, is to take what works, to adopt Nietzsche's critique, in many respects, to adopt Nietzsche's critique of modernity, but then to push Nietzsche or Nietzsche's thinking beyond itself and to provide an antidote to the last man that goes beyond the kind of wishful thinking of the Ubermensch. And let's spend just a little bit of time unpacking that, right? Again, Evola agrees with Nietzsche in so much as he believes modernity has essentially caused a fracture that has led to the loss of any meaningful reference to the transcendent. And more to that point, Evola also agrees with Nietzsche that there would certainly emerge, and remember, Evola, more so than Nietzsche, actually lives through the modern world. And so he sees with his own two eyeballs the emergence of these doubles or these surrogates that people try to use to replace God. Science, equality, democracy, etc. Right? And like Nietzsche, he understood perfectly well that these would be poor, totally dysfunctional, inarticulate, or disarticulated surrogates for God. They'd never be able to replace a truly profoundly meaningful reference to a relationship with that which is above man, that which is transcendent, because it's just rooted in a vapid, self-defeating, ultimately nihilistic materialism. Again, sort of Nietzsche himself, and particularly in a book called Ride the Tiger, there's a chapter in which he postulates or puts forward a critique of science that is very much consistent with Nietzsche's critique of science, and that he essentially agrees that science is an extraordinarily useful tool, but at best it tells us how something works. It doesn't help us answer deep ontological questions about being in really fundamental important ways, right? So while Evola shares Nietzsche's contempt for modernity's last man, and he shuns, like Nietzsche, the exaltation of comfort and happiness and pleasure. And this is all what we might call bourgeois values. When we talk about bourgeois values, most people hear bourgeois and they think like bougie, fancy, money, that kind of thing. That's one meaning of bourgeois. But in the way that Nietzsche and Evola use it, bourgeois refers to sort of like middling, middle of the road, lowest common denominator sorts of values, right? Appearances are more important than reality. Pleasure pleasure is kind of the highest value. Comfort, these sort of middling, bovine, not very thoughtful, go along with the herd. What's most important is getting along. These are kind of they're mercantile bourgeois values. And along with Nietzsche, Evola totally rejects this. But and even uh, and he also agrees with Nietzsche, and in fact, even goes well beyond Nietzsche, goes far beyond Nietzsche in essentially defending, instead of that bourgeois kind of worldview, a view of life that is hierarchical and essentially aristocratic, that is based on hierarchy, that is based on, in fact, Nietzsche had a term called the pathos of distance or the pathos of difference. In other words, it was precisely uh, rather than equality, which just renders everyone the same, and therefore anything meaningful and interesting about us totally diffuse and meaningless. It's precisely our differences that create meaning and make us interesting and give life value. This is essentially Nietzsche's view of the pathos of difference or the pathos of distance. This is a hierarchical view of nature. And an aristocratic view of life that Evola shares, and even again takes way beyond Nietzsche's view, which is ultimately materialistic, right? Whereas Nietzsche's is ultimately spiritual. And that's where we get into where these thinkers really begin to diverge from one another. Evola believes that Nietzsche, in other words, reduces what is transcendent to what is immanent. In other words, Nietzsche has quite a bit of spirit and quite a bit of vigor, but he is himself essentially a nihilist. He may be an active nihilist, but he's essentially a nihilist, and he's totally rooted in the immanent, in the worldly, in the material, and ultimately in the secular. And he what need the missing part, what's missing in Nietzsche for Evola is that connection to something transcendent. And without that, all of Nietzsche's posturing will ultimately result, however much you try to rail against it, in something like The Last Man. Um, so, for example, Evola totally rejects Nietzsche's naturalism. Um, he admits that Nietzsche's philosophy has certain life affirming characteristics, but the problem, he says, is because it lacks any connection to the truly meaningfully transcendent, because it doesn't really offer us a truth with a capital T, in other words, because it is immanent, it is of the world, um, then it really leaves us only with this world, this life, this body, this material existence. And it gives us, as I've said, a worldview that's totally divorced from the transcendent. And in this regard, and I we could probably unpack this in a totally separate podcast, but Evola even goes so far as to say that Nietzsche's philosophy of the Ubermensch really isn't that different than Marxist or communist ideologies, because it posits a being without any sort of light or higher sanction than itself. If the individual is the highest power, if there's nothing greater than the individual, then you're essentially at the level of a secular materialist ideology, not totally unlike Marxism or even communism. Although I should point out that Nietzsche was himself extraordinarily hostile to Marxism and communism. Yet, whether he realized it, at least in Evola's point of view, like Marxism and communism, Nietzsche's view pushes itself maybe to the furthest limits possible for a materialist ideology, but it remains a materialist ideology and can't get outside of matter. And if you can't get beyond matter, and you can't get to a true metaphysics, a true transcendental connection, then you can't really ever have truth with a capital T. So what does Evola propose then? Well, for Evola, who is, I have to say, as a philosopher, a little bit more complicated than Nietzsche, the superior man can only accomplish living in a truly life-affirming manner to the degree that he is, and this is a quote from Evola, to the degree that he is superior to his own individuality. And in the place of Nietzsche's Ubermensch, Evola proposes what he sometimes calls the absolute individual. What is the absolute individual? Well, for Evola, to put it in the simplest possible terms, the absolute individual is neither bound to the pretensions of the pretensions of his own ego, nor to the worldly satisfaction that it craves. In other words, he may participate in the world. He may even take pleasure in participating in certain ways in the world, but he's not tied to that. To this degree, Evola recognizes, as we've mentioned before, that Nietzsche's definition of the problem of modernity is perfectly clear and even on the nose. But he warns us that Nietzsche's solutions, particularly, again, as expressed by the philosophy of the Übermensch, because if you'll recall, that's Nietzsche's solution to the problem of modernity, as well the Übermensch. Evola says, look, you've accurately identified the problem, but your solution, particularly in so much as it's expressed by the Ubermensch, is hazy and dangerous because it lacks any connection to the transcendent. It's possible, and Nietzsche says even desirable, that the absolute individual, which is again Nietzsche's sort of version of the Ubermensch, or his response to the Ubermensch, the absolute individual will follow, like the Ubermensch, his own law. But that law will be rooted in a connection with the transcendent, whereas that's not possible for the Ubermensch, because for the Ubermensch, there's only this world, this body, this life, this material existence, right? Nietzsche essentially rejects the possibility of this transcendence and favors instead a radically immanent naturalism. And it's radical, and it certainly pushes materialism to perhaps its furthest possible reaches, but it remains fixed in the realm of immanence. And so therefore there's nothing to transcendently anchor the will. And what essentially, according to Evola, this means is we're still at the end of it all. The Ubermensch is still left stuck in a cycle of wholly relativistic affirmation of the uncontrollable impulse. So great, the Ubermensch finds meaning in the struggle to give himself his own law and to develop his own meaning and his own sense of purpose. But if it's not rooted in the transcendent, then that meaning and that purpose and that law, lacking any connection with tradition, with a capital T, is going to be relativistic, is going to be radically subjective, is going to be based in this world, and is never going to be able to get beyond it, right? We should say just a little bit more about Evola to better understand what he means by tradition, and for that matter, by modernity. Evola's understanding of a traditional worldview as opposed to a modern worldview posits that personal action should be absolute, right? And what he means by this is when we act, we should do it in such a way that we undertake action without a view toward reward or punishment, toward gain or loss, toward pleasure or pain. This is very firmly rooted in a traditional type of warrior ethics, which is totally opposed to the modern, ultimately mercantile, bourgeois ethics of the masses. A great quote that Evola would have been well familiar with comes from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verse 38. If you're not familiar, the Bhagavad Gita is the one Hindu holy text that's particularly directed toward the second estate, which is their caste of warriors, which Evola considered himself to be of the psycho-spiritual caste of warriors. And that quote from chapter 2, verse 38 of the Bhagavad Gita says, quote, "Fight for the sake of duty, treating alike happiness and distress, loss and gain, victory and defeat. Fulfilling your responsibility in this way, you will never incur sin." And that's a reasonably good, at least Hindu interpretation of what Evola means when he says that the absolute individual who advocates, to use Evola's terminology, the essential self should always act in a way that is absolute, without a view toward reward or toward punishment. Evola also takes a very, very different view of the state. It's probably not an entirely sophisticated or accurate or fair survey or commentary on Nietzsche's view of politics or the state, that essentially, to say that it essentially boils down to a might makes right kind of philosophy, because Nietzsche's view is a little bit more complicated than that. But it's unfortunately not very far from that. Whereas for Evola, the view of the state is entirely different, right? He draws his understanding of the state and politics from the world of tradition. And unlike the modern state, for Evola, the truly legitimate state is not and cannot be justified on the basis of force alone. Rather, it draws its justification from the power of its idea. And this idea is called the Imperium. And this is actually a Platonic view. It's a view consistent with Plato's view, and Evola was profoundly influenced by Plato. This is a view, a Platonic view, that essentially posits that that the state transcends history, the legitimate state, a legitimate ruler transcends history and even the material world, and instead is based on the affirmation of eternal, perennial truths, right? There's probably a great more I could say about Evola, but this podcast has already gone a lot longer than I thought that it would. I'd like to do probably another podcast about Evola in particular, just because I feel like I haven't really done him justice here. But I'll conclude with a quote from Evola, in which it's from an essay called "Overcoming the Superman," which again is a translation I don't like for the Ubermensch. So we'll say "Overcoming the Overman," and it really gets to the heart of Evola's acknowledgement of Nietzsche's being quite on the nose with respect to his analysis of the problem of modernity, but also it gets to the heart of Evola's recognition that essentially Nietzsche fails to achieve the true position. And so here's that quote: "The true type of overman is rather Olympian, a calm greatness which expresses an irresistible superiority, something which terrifies and at the same time compels veneration, which prevails and disarms without fighting, establishing suddenly the feeling of a transcendent force, completely under control, but totally capable of release. The wonderful and frightening sense, which in antiquity was associated with the concept of the noumen. Supra-life, that is, spirit, totally realized in its supernatural aspect, which permeates and governs absolutely everything which is life, is the substance here. But this type, the true Overman, cannot be treated merely as a construction of the thought of today. There is no great tradition of antiquity, whether of the East or of the West, which did not possess it. The tradition of the divine right of the legitimate kings, because they were the virile bearers of a force from above, is its last echo. To conceive the sudden reemergence of this ancient conception in a world where every great horizon is dead, where to serve as immediate ideological substance for its incarnation, there are only the profane and opaque myths of evolutionism and natural selection, and a confused need for force and liberation. To conceive this is also to understand the invisible genesis of the theory of the Nietzschean Overman, its limit, and the path which could lead beyond it. I think we'll stop there, and we'll return next time with a discussion that does Evola more justice, because I think that his ideas are very, very fascinating, and we'll be able to draw back to our discussion that we've laid out about Nietzsche as well. Thanks for listening.